Okay, the very last lesson of the genetics topic. So after this lesson, we are finished learning for genetics and we're finished learning for the year. So we're just going to look at natural selection and the advantages of actually having variation. So what is natural selection and why does variation play into that? So again, variation is the genetic differences between members of a species. Hopefully you're getting the idea that variation is definitely a definition you should be learning. If you're at that not achieved sort of level, learning the definition of variation would be hugely important. So the key sort of part to natural selection is that some individuals have alleles that make them better suited or adapted to the environment. So some individuals show a phenotypic advantage based off of their genotype. So their genotype has given them this favorable phenotype. So in terms of what do I mean by favorable? I mean that these alleles or these adaptations might help them to survive in many different ways. Like they might be able to get food easier, or find shelter easier, or escape predators easier, or find a mate easier. So those sort of things are what I'm talking about as favorable. Adaptations are things that are inheritable physical characteristics that we can pass on to our offspring. So I'm not talking about getting a fake tan, dyeing your hair, and those are favorable characteristics that might help you to survive. These are not inheritable, so that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about characteristics that have arisen from your DNA that allow you to survive better. So remember, variation in a species, we looked at this when we looked at sexual versus asexual, increases the chance of a species to survive. We're really getting away from the fact of individuals. So a key sort of marker's note from this exam is people who missed out on getting merit or excellence. We're still talking about individuals being better able to survive thanks to variation. We're moving on to the stage of looking at species as a whole surviving better through natural selection. We're not looking at individuals anymore. So if there's a change in environment, for example a drought, a lack of food, disease, climate change, there will be some individuals who are better suited to survive those changes and will therefore reproduce more, live longer, and pass on those favorable alleles. So I'm talking about members of the species will allow the species to survive. We're getting away from the fact that some individuals will die here. For example, drought, if we're talking about plants, maybe root length. Those ones with a longer root length would be able to survive the drought because they can get the water from deep down in the ground, whereas those with short roots might die out. Yeah, they died out, but as a species, the plants have not died out because there are some that were able to survive. So without variation, and we looked at this, a sudden change in the environment might mean that no individual would have the phenotype that allows them to survive. So if all plants had short roots because they reproduced asexually, leading to no variation, and a drought came along, then that whole plant species would become extinct because none of them could survive to pass on their genetic information. So this is really why we need variation to allow survival of a species. So again, when we're talking about individuals that are better suited, we're talking about the fact that they will live longer, they will find a mate easier, and they'll produce offspring they will produce offspring more than their less advantaged peers in their species group. Because of that, because they live longer, they produce more offspring, and the frequency, so the number of these alleles in that population, will increase. So if the long root allele is favoured during this drought, the frequency of the long root allele will increase as more members of the species possess that allele, because remember the short root alleles would be dying out. So the definition of natural selection here, this occurs when environmental factors favour certain phenotypes and select for or against these phenotypes. and therefore the underlying genotypes. We can't select for a phenotype without actually affecting the frequency of those DNA-based sequences. So again, we're talking about more favorable phenotypes become more frequent. So if we look at this example of the snails here, we can see the snail population shows some variation. We've got some whitey grey shells and some brown shells. Some might be more favorable than others. Natural selection says that the ones that are best suited for the environment will survive and reproduce more. So you can see the brown shell must be favoured more, because as we can see in future generations, the brown shell is more frequent than the white shell. Okay, again, another example. We've got these mice here that live on a cliff. So you can see here we've got the population of mice that's moved to a brand new area. They've got variation in their phenotype because they are white and they're black. And you can see, obviously, for these birds that like to eat these mice, the sort of tan ones are far easier to see and to eat than the dark ones. So because of this, the tan mice are eaten at a higher frequency than the black mice, so therefore the black fur colour is favoured. Because they're living longer, they're passing on their alleles, they're finding mates easier, the next generation contains a higher frequency of the black mice allele than the previous generation. So we're talking about generational sort of levels here. So again, I've made you a flowchart to sort of go on about how you would discuss this. So the first thing you want to do is start with defining what variation actually is, which is what we've been doing this whole time. We need to explain then that better suited individuals will survive better. What does that mean, survive better? It means more likely to reproduce, more likely to pass on their beneficial alleles. For marital excellence, you have to talk about passing on their successful alleles. Then the marker understands that you understand we're talking about generations passing on of alleles. Therefore, the next generation is better suited as a whole, not individuals. We've still got some that aren't suited, but as a whole, the generation is better suited. Over time, the population of whatever the example is will contain more individuals that have that beneficial phenotype. In the reverse, what would it mean if we didn't have variation? This is important for excellence. If this environmental change were to happen, all the members would be dying out and the population would become extinct if there was no variation. So let's apply this to this example. This is from 2018. So we've got herbicides that are chemicals that we use to kill weeds. Over many years, Italian ryegrass, which is a common weed, has developed a resistance to some herbicides, so it's not dying when we spray these herbicides on it. How could variation in the Italian ryegrass population help the population to develop that herbicide resistance? Okay, so we'll go through this. So we're defining variation, we're talking about the better suited alleles more likely to produce offspring, pass on those alleles, better suited, so pass on, a keyword here, increase in the number of herbicide resistant plants. If they were all the same, they would all die. So that's following that structure I just gave you. Here's another one about giraffes' necks, if you'd like to read through that yourself. But main thing, you need to print this off, annotate it, and use it to study and answer all of your practice questions.